Hey everybody, in today's video I'm going to talk about how to group values in pivot tables. Looking at this pivot table, one of the problems that you'll notice is that there are too many values here, right? So this is not really helpful in terms of a pivot table summarizing data because there's a bit too much detail in here. So I've got used car data that has brand, model, the number of miles, and the average price. So obviously, as the mile count is higher, the average is lower because the car is more used, whereas the relatively newer cars, less used, fetch higher prices. But you'll notice that there's not really any logic to how these miles are spread out just because there hasn't been any grouping applied. I just went with the data set, quickly converted it into a pivot table, and this is what I've gotten. So it's not terribly helpful, especially if you want to compare different models or different brands, different makes against one another, just because the cutoffs are not really consistent. So the one thing that you can do with pivot tables that's helpful, especially when you're doing with numerical values, is you can group them. So if I right click on this field for miles, there's an option to group. And you can see by default, it'll set my starting and my ending based on the data set. So it'll jump by a certain amount. So let's say I want it to jump by intervals of let's say 15,000. So now all of a sudden it creates that range for me. So now I've got 5,000 to just under 20,000, 50,000 to 65,000. So depending on what data set is in here, obviously if there's nothing in there, there's no point of it showing zero. So, but at least here, you've got that default set up in place and you can modify how you want this to group. So if I go back to right click and group, I can set my starting value equal to zero. Right, I can set my ending value at maybe 100,000. Right, if I wanted to have a bit more control as to what those ranges look like. So again, it'll depend on how the data set is in here, but you'll see now I've got a range that starts from 0 to 15,000. Right, so if you wanted to narrow those groups, you could go at intervals of 25,000. Right, to have fewer groups, so you don't have as many. And now it's a bit easier perhaps to compare. We've got an Accord here, 75,000 to 100,000 kilometers, a Civic here, 75 to 100,000. Now it's perhaps a bit easier to compare this data because now you've got similar comparables, and then these averages are better grouped together. So one of the things to look for when you're creating a pivot table is how well your data is grouped and whether it's comparable for the purpose of doing analysis. And if it's not, and if you've got a numerical field like mileage, then consider grouping it, because as you can see, it's really easy to do it. Just group, select your starting point. You can leave the defaults, but you'll probably want to set at least a starting or an ending point, or at least set the interval, so at least you've got some sort of consistency there between what type of range you're looking for. And as you can see, that can help clean up your data and at the same time make it a bit more comparable when you're looking at different makes, different models of cars, or whatever sort of variables you're considering. So just a quick tip on how to make your pivot tables a bit more useful.